It started quietly, the way most criminal empires do, not with gunfire, but with ships docking in New York Harbor and families carrying old country habits into a new world. By the 1920s, the American underworld was forming in real time, shaped by immigration, political pressure overseas, and a nationwide ban on alcohol that nobody was prepared to obey. Prohibition did not create organized crime in the United States, but it gave it money, structure, and purpose. As Benito Mussolini tightened his grip on Italy, cracking down on the Sicilian Mafia, many seasoned criminals fled across the Atlantic. They arrived in cities like New York, already trained in secrecy, hierarchy, and violence. At the same time, Italian-American gangs and other ethnic crews were learning that illegal liquor could turn street gangs into corporations. The merger was natural. Sicilian mafiosi brought tradition and discipline. American-born gangsters brought ambition and reach. Together, they built what became known as the American Mafia, distinct from its Italian origins, but still guided by many of the same rules. By the end of the 1920s, New York City was divided between rival powers, and those alliances were unstable. The tension exploded into what history calls the Castellammarese War, a violent struggle between two dominant bosses. One side was led by Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian-born crime leader with old-world ideas. The other was controlled by Joe Masseria, a powerful New York boss who ruled through fear and loyalty. The conflict played out in backrooms, on street corners, and in restaurants, leaving bodies behind as messages. In 1931, the war ended when Masseria was murdered while dining in a Coney Island restaurant. The killing cleared the way for Maranzano, who quickly declared himself capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. From that position, he reorganized the mafia in New York into 5 permanent families, each assigned territory and leadership. These groups would later be known as the Luciano, Galliano, Mangano, Maranzano, and Profaci families, a structure that formalized power and reduced open warfare. Each family operated with a clear chain of command, from boss to underboss to capos and soldiers. Maranzano's authority did not sit well with everyone. His claim to ultimate power created resentment among younger, more pragmatic leaders who believed the mafia should function like a boardroom, not a monarchy. One of those men was Lucky Luciano, the head of the Luciano family. Luciano had helped engineer Masseria's downfall, and he was not interested in trading one dictator for another. Later that same year, Maranzano was assassinated in his Manhattan office. The killing marked the end of the boss of all bosses concept as an official title. Luciano chose not to take the crown for himself. Instead, he kept Maranzano's family structure intact and replaced centralized rule with something more flexible. He created the Commission, a governing body made up of the major family bosses. The Commission settled disputes, approved assassinations, and managed national interests. It also extended authority beyond New York, bringing crime families in cities like Chicago under a shared system. It was less visible than a single ruler and far more effective. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the Mafia lost its most profitable racket overnight. The bosses adapted quickly. They moved into gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and legitimate industries that could be controlled quietly. Garbage hauling, construction, and waterfront unions became pipelines for steady income and influence. By the 1950s, the American Mafia had reached its height, with thousands of maid members and roughly 24 families operating across the country. Chicago became its own empire during this period, ruled not by the 5 families but by men like Al Capone, whose rise during Prohibition turned him into a national symbol of organized crime. New York produced its own legends, including Frank Costello, known for political connections, and Sam Giancana, whose reign blended violence, paranoia, and federal scrutiny. Popular culture later tried to explain this world through stories like The Godfather and television series such as The Sopranos. Those works borrowed names, habits, and attitudes from real people, but they softened the cost. The real mafia was not operatic. It was bureaucratic, calculating, and often mundane. Power came from patience and fear, not speeches. These bosses ruled through loyalty enforced by threat, and they governed empires that looked permanent until they were not. Wiretaps, informants, and federal prosecutions would eventually dismantle much of what they built, but for several decades these men controlled neighborhoods, industries, and lives. Their stories are not myths. They are records of how crime organized itself, how it survived, and how it left scars that still exist. This is the history of the men who ran the American underworld, and how they held power for as long as they did. Long before anyone called him lucky, he was Salvatore Lucania, born on November 24, 1897 in Sicily. His family arrived in New York City when he was about 10 years old, settling on the Lower East Side at a time when poverty, overcrowding, and opportunity all lived on the same block. School never held his attention. The street did. By his early teens, Lucania was already running small protection schemes, shaking down classmates for coins, picking pockets, and moving into drug sales. Crime made sense to him. It was organized, transactional, and rewarded intelligence. As he came up, Lucania crossed paths with figures outside the Italian gangs, men who would shape his worldview. He formed close ties with Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Siegel, both prominent members of Jewish criminal groups. These relationships mattered. Luciano saw early that ethnicity limited growth and alliances expanded it. That belief would later redefine how the American Mafia operated. Somewhere along the way, Salvatore Lucania became Charles Luciano. Contemporary accounts suggest he disliked the nickname Sal, believing it made him sound weak. The name change was part image, part reinvention. The nickname Lucky followed later, tied to a violent episode in 1929 that nearly killed him. Luciano was abducted by unknown assailants, beaten, stabbed, and had his throat cut before being dumped on a Staten Island beach. He survived. The attackers were never conclusively identified, and the motive remains uncertain, but the incident hardened his reputation. From then on, he was Lucky Luciano. By 1930, Luciano was deeply embedded in the power structure of New York organized crime, serving as a top lieutenant to Joe Masseria. At the same time, a violent struggle was underway between Masseria and rival boss Salvatore Maranzano. The conflict, later known as the Castellamarese War, was draining money, men, and stability. Luciano saw it as bad business. While publicly loyal to Masseria, he quietly opened channels to Maranzano, offering a solution that would end the war. In April 1931, that solution arrived. On April 15th, Masseria went to dinner at a restaurant in Coney Island, Brooklyn. Multiple historical accounts, including reporting by the New York Times, state that Luciano was present at the table. At some point, he excused himself, reportedly to the restroom. Moments later, gunmen entered and shot Masseria to death. The war was over. Maranzano emerged as the victor and declared himself Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. He reorganized the New York gangs into 5 permanent families, formalizing ranks and territories. On paper, it was order. In practice, it concentrated too much power in one man's hands. Luciano understood the danger. Within months, Maranzano was dead, stabbed and shot in his Manhattan office by assassins posing as government agents. Luciano's role was widely accepted by law enforcement and historians, though carried out at arm's length. With both old bosses gone, Luciano had no interest in wearing a crown. Instead, he built a system. He preserved the family structure and replaced personal dictatorship with collective governance. He established the Commission, a nationwide governing body designed to resolve disputes, regulate territory, and prevent wars that attracted police attention. It included the leaders of the New York families and extended influence to crime organizations in other cities. The American Mafia became corporate, disciplined, and far more resilient. For several years, Luciano lived openly as a powerful underworld figure, traveling, entertaining, and ruling through intermediaries. That ended in 1936 when he was convicted in New York on charges related to compulsory prostitution. He received a lengthy prison sentence. During World War II, the US government quietly negotiated with him for assistance securing New York Harbor, and in 1946 his sentence was commuted on the condition that he be deported to Italy. Luciano never returned to live in the United States. From Italy and later Cuba for a brief period, he remained involved in international narcotics trafficking, according to US and Italian authorities. His influence diminished but never disappeared. On January 26, 1962, Luciano suffered a fatal heart attack at Naples International Airport, where he had gone to meet a film producer interested in his life story. Italian police were preparing to arrest him on drug charges that same day. Lucky Luciano was not remembered for loyalty or kindness. He was remembered for structure. He took a chaotic collection of gangs and turned them into a lasting organization, one built on rules, profit, and restraint enforced by violence. The modern American Mafia was not born by accident, it was designed, and Luciano was the architect. Joe Bonanno came from the same violent moment in history that produced the modern American Mafia, but his story took a turn no other boss dared to make. He survived power struggles, federal pressure, internal betrayal, and a public scandal that should have ended his life. Instead, he lived into old age and left behind something unheard of in his world, his own version of the truth. Joseph Charles Bonanno was born on January 18, 1905, in Castellammare del Golfo, Sicily, a town that produced a disproportionate number of mafia figures. His family immigrated to New York City when he was young, but after about a decade in the United States, they returned to Italy. There, Bonanno came of age under the influence of the Sicilian Mafia, absorbing its codes, structure, and discipline firsthand. When Benito Mussolini began his campaign against organized crime, Bonanno returned to New York in 1924, arriving with connections and credibility that mattered. Bonanno aligned himself with the faction led by Salvatore Maranzano and rose steadily through the ranks. He was intelligent, articulate, and more formal than many of his peers. When the Castellammare War ended in 1931, with the murders of Maranzano and Joe Masseria, the old leadership was gone almost overnight. At only 26 years old, Bonanno emerged as the head of what had been the Maranzano family, which soon became known as the Bonanno family. As one of the leaders of New York's 5 families, Bonanno held a seat on the Commission, the national governing body established by Lucky Luciano. For decades, his family remained relatively stable. Bonanno later claimed that internal unity and restraint kept his organization insulated from the chaos that plagued others. Law enforcement records confirm that his name surfaced less often than many rival bosses during the 1940s and 1950s. That stability unraveled in the early 1960s. According to reporting by the New York Times, other powerful bosses, including Tommy Lucchese and Carlo Gambino, learned of a plan Bonanno was allegedly backing to have them killed and consolidate power. Whether the plot was real or exaggerated remains debated, but the response was decisive. Bonanno lost support within the commission, and his authority began to collapse. At the same time, federal scrutiny increased. Subpoenas followed, court appearances piled up. Then Bonanno vanished. For 19 months, one of the most powerful men in American organized crime was gone. He later claimed he had been kidnapped. Investigators were never able to fully confirm the story. When he resurfaced, his influence was a shadow of what it had been. By 1968, Bonanno did something almost no mafia boss ever did. He stepped away. He retired. Years later, in 1983, he crossed an even brighter line by publishing an autobiography titled A Man of Honor. In it, he described mafia life, history, and philosophy from his perspective. He framed his world as one governed by tradition and loyalty rather than chaos. The book caused outrage within organized crime circles, yet no retaliation followed. Journalist Gay Talese later explained why. Bonanno, in their view, had not cooperated with law enforcement. He had not testified. He had not worn a wire. He spoke broadly, avoided operational details, and named no living associates in criminal acts. To some bosses, that distinction mattered. Bonanno was arrested for the first time late in life and convicted in 1980 for obstruction of justice. He served time. He was released. He lived quietly afterward, dying in 2002 at the age of 97. In a world where betrayal was usually answered with murder, Joe Bonanno broke the silence and survived. Not because he was forgiven, but because he understood the line better than most. Carlo Gambino never looked the part. He was soft-spoken, neatly dressed, and polite to a fault. Federal agents who came to his home later said he offered them coffee and desserts, then talked calmly while they took notes. There was no flash to him, no public temper, no hunger for attention. Yet by the time he died in 1976, Gambino had quietly positioned himself as one of the most powerful mafia bosses America ever produced, and he had done it while barely touching a prison cell. Gambino was born in 1902 in Palermo, Sicily, in a neighborhood so dominated by the mafia that Italian police reportedly avoided entering it. Violence and authority were part of daily life there. He immigrated to Brooklyn in the early 1920s, arriving during a period when New York's underworld was consolidating power. He aligned himself with the organization led by Joe Masseria, learning how loyalty worked and how easily it could be transferred when circumstances changed. When the Castellamarese War broke out, Gambino survived by staying adaptable. After Masseria was murdered in 1931, Gambino shifted his allegiance to Salvatore Maranzano. When Maranzano was killed months later, Gambino moved again, this time into the Mangano family. That family would later be controlled by Albert Anastasia, a violent figure known for impulsive decisions and open bloodshed. Gambino remained loyal to Anastasia for years, but loyalty in that world had limits. By the 1950s, Anastasia was drawing dangerous attention. According to law enforcement and historical accounts, he ordered the killing of a civilian, a serious violation of mafia rules that endangered every boss connected to him. Gambino saw the risk clearly. On October 25, 1957, Anastasia was murdered in a barbershop at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan. The hit removed a liability, it also cleared the path. After Anastasia's death, Gambino assumed control of the family, which soon took his name. From that point on, he ruled quietly and efficiently. He avoided publicity and delegated violence to others. Under his leadership, the family expanded aggressively into gambling, loan sharking, hijacking, narcotics trafficking, and labor racketeering. Reporting by the New York Times later estimated that as many as 1,000 men were connected to Gambino operations along the eastern seaboard. Gambino's influence extended beyond his own family. He held significant sway over the other New York families and was a central figure on the commission, the governing body of the American Mafia. His power came from patience and memory. Associates learned quickly that insults were never forgotten. One man, Dominic Sciallo, reportedly insulted Gambino while drunk during a dinner. Gambino did not respond. Weeks later, Sciallo was found buried in cement. No speech followed. No explanation was offered. For all of this, Gambino spent remarkably little time behind bars. Over a criminal career that stretched roughly 50 years, he served a total of 22 months in prison. He avoided long sentences by keeping his name off indictments and letting others take risks. When he died on October 15, 1976, it was from natural causes, in his home on Long Island, surrounded by family. Carlo Gambino built power the way he lived, quietly, methodically, and without spectacle. He did not seek fame, he sought control, and by the time his heart finally failed, he had achieved it. When Frank Costello sat before the United States Senate in the early 1950s and answered questions about organized crime, he did something almost unthinkable for a mafia boss. He spoke. He did not hide behind the Fifth Amendment. He did not shout or threaten. He answered calmly in a low, gravelly voice, projecting control rather than fear. The performance left a lasting impression, not only on the American public, but years later on actor Marlon Brando, who drew from Costello's mannerisms when shaping Don Vito Corleone in The Godfather. Frank Costello was born Francesco Castiglia in Italy in 1891. He immigrated to the United States as a child and grew up in East Harlem, where poverty and crime overlapped easily. Like many young men in that environment, he found opportunity outside the law early. He anglicized his name, becoming Frank Costello, and moved steadily into organized crime rather than street-level violence. From the beginning, he preferred influence over intimidation. Costello aligned himself closely with Lucky Luciano, a partnership that would define his rise. Luciano valued Costello's political instincts and temperament. After the Castellamarese War reshaped the American Mafia in 1931, Costello benefited directly from Luciano's ascent. He became a top advisor and later the consigliere of the Luciano family, operating as a bridge between the underworld and legitimate power brokers. When Luciano was convicted in 1936 and later deported, and when his underboss Vito Genovese fled to Italy to avoid prosecution, a vacuum opened at the top. Costello stepped into it quietly. He became the acting boss of the family, which would later take Genovese's name. Under Costello's leadership, the organization avoided public bloodshed and leaned heavily into gambling and political connections. He cultivated judges, police officials, and politicians, earning the nickname the Prime Minister for his diplomatic style. That same style was on display during the televised Senate hearings on organized crime. Costello appeared composed, almost bored, as senators questioned him. Cameras were not allowed to show his face, only his hands, but his voice carried. The moment humanized the mafia for many Americans and irritated law enforcement, who believed he was using charm as a shield. The attention brought consequences. Costello faced multiple legal challenges, including a contempt charge after he walked out on part of his testimony. More dangerous was the threat from within his own organization. In 1957, Genovese returned to the United States and moved to reclaim control. That year, Costello was shot in the head in the lobby of his apartment building. The bullet grazed him. He survived. The message was clear. Rather than ignite a war, Costello chose survival. He agreed to step aside, ceding control of the family to Genovese. It was a rare decision in a world where stepping down often meant a coffin. Costello kept his wealth, his connections, and his life. He withdrew from daily operations and lived quietly. Frank Costello died in 1973 at the age of 82 at home, wealthy and free. Few mafia bosses managed that ending. His legacy was not built on fear, but on influence, restraint, and an understanding that power did not always require violence. In the end, it was that calm authority that echoed most loudly, from Senate chambers to cinema screens. Vito Genovese wanted power, and he wanted it openly. Unlike other mafia leaders who preferred influence from the shadows, Genovese chased authority directly, even when it put him in danger. That hunger carried him to the top of the American Mafia, stripped him of it, and then carried him there again. It also guaranteed that his life would end behind prison walls. Vito Genovese was born in Naples, Italy, on November 21, 1897. As a teenager, he immigrated to New York City with his family and settled into the same neighborhoods that produced much of the city's early organized crime leadership. He gravitated quickly toward crime and formed a close alliance with Lucky Luciano. Together, they aligned themselves with Joe Masseria, one of the most powerful mafia leaders of the era. That loyalty was temporary. During the Castellamarese War, Luciano and Genovese concluded that Masseria was an obstacle. According to reporting by the New York Times, Genovese is believed to have been one of the gunmen involved in Masseria's assassination on April 15, 1931, carried out while Masseria dined at a restaurant in Coney Island. The killing reshaped the underworld overnight. As Luciano consolidated power following the murders of Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, Genovese rose with him. By the mid-1930s, Genovese had become Luciano's underboss and one of the most feared figures in New York. In 1936, when Luciano was convicted on prostitution-related charges and later deported, Genovese briefly stepped into the role of acting boss of the Luciano family. That first reign did not last. In 1937, Genovese was indicted for murder. Rather than face trial, he fled to Italy, where he found protection under Benito Mussolini's regime and remained active in organized crime. Before leaving, he handed operational control of the family to Frank Costello, a decision he would later regret. After World War II, Genovese returned to the United States and expected his old position to be waiting. It was not. Costello had solidified his control and had no intention of stepping aside. Genovese appealed to Luciano, then living in Cuba, and proposed reviving the title of boss of all bosses with himself in the role. Luciano shut him down completely. Luciano's response was blunt and final. There would be no boss of bosses. Genovese was told to fall in line. He did not. In 1957, Genovese moved decisively. He supported Carlo Gambino in the plot to eliminate Albert Anastasia, whose impulsive violence had alarmed other leaders. Anastasia was murdered in a Manhattan barbershop on October 25, 1957. Around the same time, Genovese ordered an assassination attempt on Costello. Costello survived the shooting, but the message landed. He stepped aside and surrendered control of the family. Genovese had reached the top again. This time, the family would bear his name. The victory was brief. In 1959, federal prosecutors convicted Genovese on narcotics trafficking charges. The case was built with testimony from informants and rival criminals, and it ended his freedom permanently. He was sentenced to prison, where he continued to exert influence through intermediaries, though his power steadily eroded. Vito Genovese died of a heart attack on February 14, 1969, at the age of 71 inside the federal prison system. He had achieved everything he chased: dominance, authority, fear. He also paid the full price and he fought his way to the top twice. And the second time, there was no way out. Paul Castellano did not rise through the mafia the way most bosses did. He was not a street enforcer, not a prolific gunman, and not a product of back-alley ambition. He was a boardroom boss, groomed for power through blood ties and trusted by one of the most careful mafia leaders in American history. That pedigree carried him to the top of the Gambino family. It also made him a target. Constantino Paul Castellano was born on June 26, 1915 in Brooklyn, New York. Organized crime was already part of his family structure. His cousin was Carlo Gambino, the man who would quietly dominate the American Mafia for decades. Castellano's sister later married Gambino, tightening the bond between them. By the time Castellano reached adulthood, his future inside the Gambino organization was all but set. Castellano rose through the ranks without ever building a reputation as a violent street boss. Instead, he focused on white-collar rackets, construction, meat distribution, and labor control. He lived comfortably, distanced himself from day-to-day violence, and ruled from his Staten Island mansion. That style appealed to Gambino, who believed visibility brought prison. When Gambino died of natural causes in 1976, he bypassed more street-oriented contenders and named Castellano as his successor. At that moment, Castellano inherited the most powerful crime family in New York City. The Gambino family had more soldiers, more money, and more influence than its rivals. To law enforcement and other bosses, Castellano was effectively the most powerful mafia leader in the country. Some even referred to him as a boss of bosses, though no official title existed. Inside his own family, respect was more fragile. Castellano's reclusive nature created distance between him and the captains who operated on the street. He rarely attended social gatherings, avoided traditional mafia rituals, and preferred meetings at his home. That earned him another nickname, the Howard Hughes of the Mafia. It was not a compliment. Many soldiers believed he did not understand their world or their risks. By the mid-1980s, pressure closed in. Castellano and other Gambino leaders were indicted under the Federal Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. A separate prosecution loomed over a large car theft ring tied to the family. Prison was no longer theoretical. At the same time, Castellano enforced a strict ban on drug trafficking following Gambino's philosophy. For younger members, especially those earning heavily from narcotics, the rule felt outdated and costly. One of those men was John Gotti, a rising captain from Queens. Gotti was popular, visible, and deeply connected to the street crews. He believed Castellano was leading the family into disaster and protecting his own circle at the expense of others. As Castellano prepared for trial, Gotti concluded that waiting would end with him in prison or dead by internal purge. On December 16, 1985, Castellano and his underboss Thomas Bellotti arrived at Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan for a meeting. As they exited their car, gunmen approached and opened fire. Castellano was struck repeatedly and died at the scene. Bellotti was killed moments later. The hit was carried out in public during the evening rush, without any attempt at subtlety. The assassination sent shockwaves through organized crime. A sitting mafia boss had been murdered without commission approval, in full view of the city. Within days, Gotti took control of the Gambino family. His reign would be louder, flashier, and shorter than Castellano's. Paul Castellano was buried with wealth, power, and status intact, but no protection from betrayal. He ruled from behind walls, trusted structure over loyalty, and underestimated the ambition beneath him. In the end, the man chosen by Carlo Gambino fell to the man Carlo Gambino would never have trusted. Gotti did not inherit power. He took it in public, in traffic, under bright Manhattan lights. That single decision made him famous, feared, and ultimately doomed. For a brief stretch at the end of the 20th century, he became the face of the American Mafia, a man who looked untouchable until he was not. John Joseph Gotti Jr. was born on October 27, 1940 in the Bronx and raised in East New York, Brooklyn. He came up poor, left school early, and attached himself to the Gambino family while still a teenager. By his early teens, he was already running errands and taking risks for the organization. Violence came naturally. Prison did too. What separated Gotti from others was not discipline, but charisma. People liked him. People followed him. His rise accelerated under the protection of Aniello Della Croce, the feared and respected underboss of the Gambino family. Della Croce valued street loyalty, and Gotti embodied it. After Carlo Gambino died in 1976, Della Croce remained the emotional center of the family, even as leadership passed to Paul Castellano. Gotti never accepted that choice. Castellano ruled from a distance, focusing on white-collar rackets and avoiding street exposure. Gotti lived the opposite way. He gambled heavily, associated openly with heroin dealers despite formal bans, and drew constant law enforcement attention. Castellano disapproved. The tension grew worse as the years passed, but it reached a breaking point in December 1985 when Della Croce died of cancer. Castellano did not attend the funeral, citing surveillance concerns. To Gotti and many others, it was an unforgivable insult. Castellano was also facing serious legal trouble, including racketeering charges that threatened to send him to prison. Inside the family, resentment spread. Gotti moved carefully, sounding out allies within the Gambino ranks and quietly gauging reactions from members of the Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families. He did not seek formal approval, he sought silence. On December 16, 1985, Castellano and his underboss, Thomas Bellotti, arrived at Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. Gotti waited nearby in a car, listening on a radio. As Castellano stepped out onto the sidewalk, gunmen approached and opened fire. Both men were killed within seconds. The hit was efficient, public, and unmistakable. With that, John Gotti became boss of the Gambino family. He also crossed a line that could not be erased. Other leaders, including Vincent Gigante, were furious that the assassination had been carried out without commission approval. An attempt was later made on Gotti's life, but it failed. Gotti remained standing. In court, he seemed unstoppable. Case after case collapsed. Witnesses recanted. Juries acquitted. The press crowned him the Dapper Don for his tailored suits and the Teflon Don because convictions never stuck. He embraced the attention, smiling for cameras, holding court outside social clubs, behaving like a celebrity in a business built on invisibility. That visibility caught up with him. In 1990, federal prosecutors brought a sweeping racketeering case that included murder charges tied to Castellano's death. This time, the government had something it never had before. Gotti's own underboss, Sammy Gravano, agreed to testify. Gravano detailed murders, meetings, and orders. The shield was gone. In 1992, John Gotti was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. He would never leave federal custody. He died on June 10, 2002, from cancer inside a prison hospital. John Gotti ruled New York loudly, briefly, and in full view. He turned the mafia into a spectacle and himself into a symbol. The same spotlight that lifted him is the one that burned him down. Alphonse Capone never ruled New York, but he did something just as lasting. He made organized crime impossible to ignore. While other bosses worked quietly behind layers of insulation, Capone embraced notoriety, money, and press attention. By the time the federal government caught up with him, he had already become the most recognizable mob boss in American history. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York, to Italian immigrant parents. He grew up in a rough neighborhood and left school early, drifting towards street gangs as a teenager. His earliest serious connection to organized crime came through Johnny Torrio, a disciplined and strategic gangster who recognized Capone's potential. Capone and his older brother Frank began running errands and enforcing debts, learning the mechanics of power young. In 1917, Capone earned the nickname that would follow him forever. While working as a bouncer at a Brooklyn bar, he made an inappropriate remark about a woman. Her brother responded by slashing Capone across the face with a knife. The scars never faded. Capone despised the nickname Scarface, but the public never forgot it. By 1920, Capone left New York for Chicago, joining Torrio full-time. Contemporary accounts suggest he moved after angering members of the White Hand Gang, a rival Irish organization. That same year, Torrio took control of the Chicago outfit following the assassination of Jim Colosimo. Prohibition had just begun, and Chicago was about to become one of the most profitable criminal markets in the country. Torrio built the outfit methodically, focusing on bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution. Capone became his chief lieutenant. In 1925, Torrio was badly wounded in an assassination attempt and decided to step away from the business, returning to Italy. Leadership passed to Capone. He was 26 years old. As boss, Capone expanded aggressively. Illegal breweries, speakeasies, brothels, and betting operations brought in millions of dollars. He paid off police, judges, and politicians, and he made sure the press knew his name. He donated to charities, handed out cash in public, and cultivated an image as a man who provided what the public wanted, while the government failed to do so. To many Americans frustrated with prohibition, he appeared almost sympathetic. Behind the image was violence. Capone ruled through fear and efficiency. Rivals who resisted were beaten, shot, or disappeared. That violence reached a peak on February 14, 1929, when 7 men associated with rival gangster George Moran were lined up and gunned down inside a Chicago garage in what became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Capone was in Florida at the time and he was never charged, but law enforcement and the public widely believed the attack was carried out on his orders. The massacre horrified the nation and forced the federal government to act. Capone was labeled Public Enemy Number 1. Investigators struggled to tie him directly to murders or bootlegging operations. Witnesses vanished or refused to talk. The breakthrough came from a quieter angle. Money. On June 5, 1931, Capone was arrested on 22 counts of federal income tax evasion. Prosecutors did not need to prove murder, they only needed to show that Capone lived lavishly and paid no taxes. He was convicted later that year and sentenced to prison. Capone was first sent to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, where he continued to exert influence. In 1934, he was transferred to Alcatraz, where isolation ended his control. His health deteriorated rapidly due to untreated syphilis, which had begun to damage his mind and body. Released in 1939, Capone spent his final years in declining health, living quietly in Florida with his wife, May. The man who once controlled Chicago's underworld could barely hold a conversation. He died on January the 25th, 1947, at the age of 48. Al Capone built an empire on alcohol, corruption, and bloodshed, then lost it all to a ledger and a courtroom. He did not fall in a shootout. He faded away. And that ending says as much about American justice as his rise ever did. Sam Giancana lived at the intersection of organized crime and American power, a place where facts blur, allegations multiply, and certainty is rare. He rose from the streets of Chicago to the top of the outfit, but what made him infamous was not only his brutality or ambition. It was the long shadow cast by his alleged connections to presidents, intelligence agencies, and events that reshaped American history. Salvatore Giancana was born on May 15, 1908, in Chicago, Illinois, to Italian immigrant parents. He grew up in a tough neighborhood and gravitated early toward violence and petty crime. As a young man, he led a crew known as the 42 Gang, a group of street toughs involved in robberies, extortion, and assaults. The gang's activity drew police attention and filled Giancana's arrest record, but it also drew the attention that mattered more. The scale of the gang's operations reportedly caught the eye of Al Capone. According to later interviews with underworld figures, including Tony Montana, cited by the Los Angeles Times, the gang was shaking down so many businesses that Capone noticed. Giancana was brought into the outfit, initially working as a driver and errand man. It was an entry point. He learned quickly. Even after Capone went to prison in 1931, Giancana continued to climb. He survived arrests, prison time, and internal rivalries. By the 1950s, he had consolidated control and emerged as the dominant boss of the Chicago outfit, overseeing gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. Unlike Capone, Giancana preferred a lower public profile, but his temper and volatility made him feared inside his own organization. It was during this period that Giancana's name began appearing in places far outside traditional mob business. One set of allegations centered on his relationship with John F. Kennedy. Giancana was reportedly connected to Kennedy through Judith Campbell Exner, who later claimed to have been involved with both men. Some investigators and journalists alleged that Giancana and other outfit figures helped deliver Illinois for Kennedy in the 1960 presidential election through voter manipulation in Chicago. These claims have been widely reported, but never proven in court. Another set of allegations tied Giancana to U.S. intelligence operations. During the early 1960s, the CIA explored covert efforts to assassinate Fidel Castro after the Cuban Revolution shut down mob-controlled casinos in Havana. Declassified documents and congressional investigations later confirmed that the CIA contacted organized crime figures as part of these plots. Giancana's name surfaced repeatedly, though the precise extent of his involvement remains disputed and partially redacted. The most explosive allegation followed the assassination of President Kennedy in November 1963. Over the years, conspiracy theories placed Giancana at the center of supposed retaliation, betrayal, or silencing operations. No credible evidence has ever proven Giancana's involvement in the assassination. What is verifiable is that the U.S. House Select Committee on Assassinations sought to question him in the 1970s about his knowledge of both the CIA plots and possible organized crime connections to Kennedy's death. That testimony never happened. On June 19, 1975, Giancana was shot multiple times in the head and neck while cooking dinner in the basement of his Oak Park, Illinois home. The killing was methodical. No signs of forced entry were found. The murder weapon was never recovered. No one was charged. Speculation followed immediately. Some believe Giancana was killed by fellow mobsters to prevent him from talking. Others pointed to personal relationships, intelligence agencies, or unrelated grudges. No theory has been proven. Law enforcement files remain inconclusive. Sam Giancana spent his life moving between worlds that rarely leave clean records behind. He understood violence, leverage, and secrecy. In the end, he carried too many stories and trusted too few people. His death closed one chapter of organized crime history and sealed another behind unanswered questions. For decades, people in Greenwich Village watched a strange figure shuffle down the sidewalk. He wore a bathrobe. His hair was uncombed. He muttered to himself and stared at the pavement. To neighbors, he looked harmless, unstable, and forgotten by the world. What they did not see was that this man was running one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America. His name was Vincent Gigante, and the madness was an act. Vincent Louis Gigante was born on March 28, 1928, in New York City. He grew up in a working-class Italian neighborhood and drifted into crime early. As a young man, he became closely aligned with Vito Genovese, one of the most ruthless and ambitious mafia leaders of the era. According to law enforcement accounts, Genovese helped Gigante's family financially, including paying for surgery for Gigante's mother. That loyalty was never forgotten. Gigante built a reputation as a dependable enforcer. He was not flashy. He did not seek attention. He did what he was told. His nickname, The Chin, came from a childhood habit of sticking out his chin, not from bravado. By the 1950s, his arrest record was already long, and his role inside the Genovese organization was solidifying. In 1957, Genovese made his move to seize full control of the family from Frank Costello. That effort turned violent. On May 2, 1957, Costello was shot in the head in the lobby of his Manhattan apartment building. He survived. The New York Times later reported that a doorman identified Gigante as the gunman. Costello, when questioned, claimed he did not recognize his attacker. Soon after, Costello stepped aside and Genovese took over. Gigante had proven his loyalty. When Genovese was later imprisoned on narcotics charges, the family remained powerful. Over time, Gigante moved steadily upward. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, he emerged as the true power behind the Genovese family. Unlike other bosses of the era, he avoided publicity entirely. He did not attend flashy events. He did not court the media. Instead, he perfected something no one else had attempted at that scale. He disappeared in plain sight. Gigante began presenting himself as mentally ill. He wandered his neighborhood in a bathrobe and slippers. He mumbled incoherently. He appeared confused and detached. Surveillance agents followed him and reported what they saw. Defense attorneys later leaned heavily on this behavior, arguing that Gigante was incapable of understanding or participating in criminal activity. For years, the strategy worked. Behind the scenes, Gigante was fully engaged. He communicated through trusted intermediaries. Orders were passed quietly. Meetings were indirect. Under his leadership, the Genovese family strengthened its grip on labor unions, construction, gambling, and racketeering. Other bosses respected him. Federal investigators underestimated him. The act bought him time. Eventually, the illusion collapsed. Prosecutors gathered testimony from cooperating witnesses and intercepted communications that showed clear, rational decision-making. In 1996, a federal judge ruled that Gigante was competent to stand trial. The bathrobe no longer mattered. In 1997, Vincent Gigante was convicted on racketeering and conspiracy charges and sentenced to 12 years in prison. The court openly stated that his Insanity Act had been one of the most elaborate frauds ever perpetrated on the justice system. He was sent to a federal medical facility where his health declined. Gigante died on December 19, 2005, at the age of 77, while still in custody. For years, he convinced a city that he was broken. In reality, he was disciplined, calculating, and patient. Vincent Gigante did not evade justice forever, but few men ever delayed it for so long by pretending to be someone else entirely.